In July 2025, suddenly over 400 games quietly vanished from Steam. There was no announcement and no court order involved, just gone. Entire libraries delisted, developer pages wiped, and worst of all, unless you were watching Steam DB, you probably didn't even notice. At first, this looked like your typical content moderation sweep, the usual cleanup of questionable visual novels, but we would soon learn that this wasn't routine. It was the direct result of a dubious campaign perpetrated by a bizarre fringe activist group most gamers have never heard of, an odious organisation that blends their version of radical feminism with hardline religious ideology. Believing that they have the right to censor, it appears that they have made it their mission to purge anything they find morally offensive. While in most cases it feels like the majority of us just find these sorts of people mildly annoying, horrifyingly in this instance their calculated campaign worked. As of the time of writing this video, more than 17,000 titles are now unsearchable on platforms like itch.io, and hundreds more have been removed outright from Steam. The sinister group behind this is called Collective Shout and has been pushing their agenda onto the world by what seems any means necessary. You see, instead of pushing for legislation or democratic reform, they went straight to the top of the financial food chain. Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Discover, JCB and PaySafe. In a series of pressure letters, they accused these platforms of facilitating games which contain unacceptable themes. Within days, Valve quietly amended its developer guidelines, adding a clause stating that any content violating payment processor and card network rules would no longer be allowed, silently shifting power from developers and players to credit card companies. Suddenly, hundreds of games are gone, not because they broke the law or anything, but because a few unelected ideologues decided they shouldn't exist. And the world's largest financial networks agreed. No public debate was needed and there's no transparency involved, just swift, corporate-enforced censorship masquerading as risk management. And in my opinion, what games you want to play should be up to you. For example, you might want to take advantage of the fact that right now you can grab 43% off Expedition 33, 37% off Black Myth Wukong, 29% off Stellar Blade and 32% off the stunning Wu Chang Fallen Feathers, all through my discount links below. Thousands of retro and modern games are currently up to 90% off, so whether you're curating your forever library or panic buying before another purge, don't pay full price like a muppet. Click the pinned comment, build your collection and enjoy the games you actually want while you still can. So, who exactly are the people behind this sweeping act of censorship? Who was it that managed to pressure billion-dollar financial institutions into acting as global morality police? Well, as mentioned earlier, the perpetrators are Collective Shout, but who exactly is this shady outfit? According to many online sources, Collective Shout is an Australian activist group that brands itself as a grassroots campaign for a world free of sexploitation. But behind the slogans lies something far more extreme, as we shall quickly learn. The organisation was founded in 2009 by Melinda Tankard-Rice, a self-described pro-life feminist. Collective Shout appears to be one of those groups that operate at the intersection of radical feminism, Christian fundamentalism, and moral authoritarianism. They're anti-porn, anti-sex work, anti-abortion, and openly hostile to sexual expression in media, not just in Australia, but anywhere their influence can reach. Rice's ideological roots are hardly subtle. From 1993 to 2005, she served as an advisor to Senator Brian Harradine, a Catholic ultra-conservative who helped block the abortion pill RU486, opposing contraception and IVF, and pushing policies aligned with Opus Dei-style Catholic groups. Rice has gone as far as to describe adult entertainment as cultural terrorism and describes abortion as violence against women. After her time in politics, she became a senior lecturer at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, a private Catholic institution that aligns its curriculum with church doctrine. Her activism isn't just informed by religion, it's shaped by it. The group's campaigns manager, Caitlin Roper, shares the same ideological fervour. She co-founded the Feminist Academy of Technology and Ethics, authored Sex Dolls, Robots and Woman-Hating, and serves on the board of Reclaim the Night Perth. All of this doesn't build up a good picture because it paints Roper not as a neutral advocate for balanced policy, but as a hardened ideologue with a long history of conflating fringe technology and lawful adult expression with systemic abuse, leaving little room for nuance, artistic freedom, or democratic debate. On top of all of this, Collective Shout's leadership is stacked with ex-government advisors, missionaries, anti-trafficking NGO staff and corporate risk consultants, many of whom conflate consensual sex work with slavery and push deeply religious values under the guise of consumer protection. This is not just a scrappy activist group shouting from the sidelines, it's a well-funded, highly coordinated operation with deep ties to Australian institutions, including the education sector, regulatory bodies, and public funding channels. And now they are coming for your games. Their tactics are ruthless and effective. They don't lobby governments or push for new legislation. They pressure corporations directly, sending coordinated emails to PR departments, shareholders, and risk officers loaded with phrases like digital trafficking and child abuse simulators. They don't need evidence, they don't need public support. They just need to convince the right risk-adverse executive that hosting a game might end up looking bad on a quarterly report. The moment Collective Shout flooded inboxes with a spreadsheet of problematic games, platforms like Steam and payment processors like Visa and MasterCard quietly fell in line. They complied without resistance. The cold reality is, though, these corporations don't actually care about protecting women or children. What they care about is plausible deniability, outsourcing moral control to a fringe group with an authoritarian worldview when dressing it up as progressive activism. To them, this is just risk management. Silencing niche creators and delisting adult content is a safe investment option, an easy way to avoid PR scandals without having to stand for anything at all. So, now that we know who these people are and what they have achieved, let's look at how they pulled it off in less than a week. What unfolded in July 2025 should concern anyone who even remotely cares about digital media, creative autonomy, or freedom of expression. It began on the 22nd of March when a controversial visual novel titled No Mercy Hangover launched on Steam with the tagline, "Never take no for an answer." The game featured non-consensual themes and initially slipped under the radar, but that changed on the 3rd of April when Collective Shout discovered it and launched a campaign to have it removed. They gathered 70,000 petition signatures and flooded Valve with 3,463 emails, all directed to CEO Gabe Newell. On the 11th of April, Valve caved and pulled the game, but rather than claim victory, Collective Shout escalated. The turning point came on the 11th of July when they issued an open letter to the CEOs of Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Discover, JCB, and PaySafe, accusing Steam of hosting over 500 games containing and incest content. The letter included no legal citations, no nuance, and no appeals, just incendiary claims designed to trigger panic within corporate compliance departments, and, well, it worked. On the 16th of July, Valve quietly added Clause 15 to the Steamworks distribution agreement. This new clause stated that any game violating the rules of payments processors and card networks could now be removed. No specifics were listed and there was no examples, no appeals, and in a single sentence, Valve had effectively handed editorial control of its platform to private financial entities with no transparency or oversight, and they didn't publicly acknowledge the change, but of course, the general public would soon learn the truth. Between the 16th and 19th of July, watchdog site SteamDB recorded over 400 game removals, the vast majority being adult visual novels and simulators. Many had previously passed the Steam's own moderation, and developers were given no notice. Some were flagged for vague tag violations, others for adult themes that had never been a problem before. A few received internal notices that payouts were frozen due to payment risk concerns. Collective Shout emboldened openly celebrated the purge. Only 82 remained, they boasted, claiming they had crippled an entire genre in 72 hours. This left a sour taste in many gamers' mouths, especially based on the fact that not all of these titles are just low-effort shock titles. Some were mature, narrative-driven indies. Others were caught in the purge because of user-submitted tags and not their actual content. Legitimate developers who followed all existing rules were delisted anyway. Rather expectedly, the backlash was swift. PC Gamer ran the headline, "Australian anti-corn group claims responsibility." Everyone hated that, capturing the overwhelming online disdain for Collective Shout's role in pressuring Steam. Gamers, developers and commentators across the political spectrum criticised the move as puritanical overreach and financial censorship. Anna Valens, one of the few Western journalists covering the story seriously, revealed that Vice's owner, Savage Ventures, had requested the removal of her articles on Collective Shout, not due to any journalistic inaccuracy, but because of concerns about the controversial subject matter. Proving, once again, that censorship doesn't always arrive with sirens and handcuffs. Sometimes it trickles down via corporate liability decisions. When even critical reporting about censorship is censored, it becomes clear that the goal isn't safety or responsibility, it's control. And the price is an open internet. In Japan, the reaction was even more severe. Multiple developers reported frozen payouts and delisted games, despite complying with Japanese law. Yamada Taro, a member of the Japanese Diet, called the move neo-colonial speech policing and opened a formal investigation into foreign financial influence on Japan's digital markets. Publications like Automaton and GameSpark accused Western institutions of treating Japanese developers as convenient cultural scapegoats. This has gone far beyond just a Steam problem. It's a global precedent, and a dangerous one at that. This terrible situation highlights a deeper truth that, up until this point, rarely got acknowledged enough. The fact that we appear to live in a universe where Visa and MasterCard run the modern internet rather than governments, voters, or even platforms themselves. Between them, these two companies process over 85% of credit card transactions in the United States and more than 80% of global card-based payments. If you operate a storefront, whether that's Steam, Itch.io, DL Site, Patreon, Fanbox, Subscribestar, or even a Discord Nitro, your survival depends on remaining in their good graces. Lose access to Visa and MasterCard, and suddenly your revenue vanishes overnight. Worse still, because these are private corporations, their rule books are invisible. They are drafted and enforced by legal teams and compliance officers behind closed doors without public scrutiny or accountability. These companies have policies buried in their obscure compliance frameworks that most people will have never heard of, such as Specialty Merchant Registration, which states that any merchant selling adult content must prove they've implemented rigorous moderation, strict age verification, and rapid takedown systems. Failure to comply can result in account freezes, massive fines, or total loss of service. Then there's the so-called brand damage clause, a vague provision that allows Visa or MasterCard to sever ties with any business they believe poses a reputational risk. These features allow for what is known as choke point censorship. After all, there's no need for governments to ban content when financial gatekeepers can make it unviable instead. This means there are no trials, no legislation, and no democratic oversight, just a silent cutoff that renders content unprofitable or unpublishable. And this isn't new, it's just expanding. In 2010, when WikiLeaks published classified diplomatic cables, Visa and MasterCard didn't sue, they simply blocked donations. Within days, the site was nearly bankrupt, and it only recovered after years of litigation in Iceland. In 2020, both companies severed ties with Pornhub after a controversial New York Times expose. The article's claims were later criticised for lacking evidence and context, but the fallout was immediate. Over 80% of the site's content was deleted in just 4 days, including countless legal uploads from verified performers. In 2021, MasterCard introduced these standards for adult content merchants, requiring ID verification for every individual in every frame of every video. OnlyFans, a platform built on adult content, responded by announcing a ban on explicit material. The decision was reversed after a huge mass outrage, but the message was clear: when the banks speak, creators obey. And now, as of 2025, it's the gaming industry's turn. Collective Shout's open letter on the 11th of July accused Steam of enabling abusive and illegal content, even though the games were legal in their home countries. They sent this letter to Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Discover, JCB and PaySafe, as I mentioned earlier, and no courts were consulted. No evidence was required, but the payments processors chose to take action anyway. Responding to this, on the 16th of July, Valve had amended its developer agreement, and just 3 days later, over 400 games had disappeared. The situation is chilling, to say the least. As Nier creator Yoko Taro put it, when commenting on the situation, he stated, "This is a security hole that endangers democracy itself." Because, let's be clear about this isn't just about what got removed, it's about who gets to decide what's allowed in the first place. And more, that power doesn't rest with lawmakers, citizens, or even the platform staff. It sits with a handful of anonymous compliance officers embedded inside vast, unaccountable corporate ecosystems, responding to moral panic from fringe lobbyists like Collective Shout. Let's peel back another layer, because Visa and MasterCard didn't invent this culture of censorship on their own. There's a deeper force behind it, which is quieter, much more abstract, but much more powerful. And I'm talking about BlackRock and Vanguard, the two largest asset managers on the planet. Together, they oversee $17 trillion in combined assets and own roughly 15% of the voting shares in both Visa and MasterCard. That makes them among the most influential shareholders these companies report to, and their existence makes the work easier for groups like Collective Shout, because when a tiny activist organization wants to exert pressure, it doesn't need to sway millions of consumers. It only needs to nudge a handful of compliance officers, who in turn are guided by risk-averse corporate boards, who in turn answer to institutional shareholders like BlackRock and Vanguard. These asset managers don't push any one ideology directly, they simply reward stability and brand safety over free expression. In that environment, moral panic becomes a tool, not a threat, allowing groups like Collective Shout to frame their demands as goods business rather than ideological enforcement. These asset managers are not telling anyone what games to ban, as they don't even need to, because the pressure they exert comes through a different mechanism altogether: ESG, or environmental, social and governance scoring. On paper, ESG sounds like a good idea, a way to reward companies for behaving responsibly, being greener, fairer, more ethical, but in practice, it creates a top-down system where vague, politically malleable criteria decides which businesses get investment and which ones are quietly cut off. It incentivizes corporations not to serve customers or innovate, but to appease unelected third-party scorers. And because no one votes for these standards, there's little transparency over who sets them or how they're measured. It becomes a shadow system of soft coercion. Companies desperate to maintain a high ESG score and stay in the good graces of asset managers preemptively sanitize their platforms. Controversial creators, niche products, and artistic risks are the first to go, not because they're illegal or harmful, but because they might make someone at BlackRock squint. This is exactly why a growing number of people view these asset management giants, BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street, as something close to evil. Not in the cartoonish sense of moustache-twirling villains, but because they operate with immense unaccountable power that quietly shapes the world without ever facing a vote, a headline, or a meaningful check. When a few firms manage trillions in assets and hold significant stakes in nearly every major company, media, tech, finance, energy, defense, they stop being passive investors. They become kingmakers. And while they claim to merely advise or guide, their influence over corporate behavior is profound. Through mechanisms like ESG scoring, they don't need to issue orders. Companies simply fall in line, fearing disinvestment, reputational damage, or being flagged as high risk in someone's spreadsheet. The free market doesn't actually exist. It's a managed one. And it's being managed by entities that act as gatekeepers between capital and creation, and the result is a slow, creeping form of centralization where cultural, economic, and even moral decisions are funneled through the filter of a few assets managers whose priorities are shaped by optics and portfolio stability than by public interest. It's my opinion that their very existence is why Valve delisted games with no public explanation, why Itch.io de-indexed over 17,000 titles overnight, why Japanese developers had payouts frozen despite following all local laws. None of this was about a single offensive game. It was about perceived risk echoing up the financial chain. If you still think this was just about scrubbing a few dodgy visual novels from Steam, you're missing the bigger picture. Because the fallout isn't just about content, it's about culture. And no country is feeling that impact more acutely than Japan. Japanese developers, particularly those in the visual novel space, adult indie circles, or niche narrative games, are being disproportionately targeted. Studios have reported frozen payouts, as I mentioned earlier, shadow banned listings, and unexplained delistings, all under vague labels like payments processor compliance or risk violations. These aren't illegal works. They simply failed to match the cultural expectations of Western compliance departments. Platforms like Itch.io, once a haven for creative freedom, de-indexed over 17,000 titles from search, a staggering portion of which were Japanese, purely to stay brand safe. And worse still, the standards are wildly inconsistent. Japanese creators are penalized for stylized characters, taboo topics, or anime aesthetics, even when their content is age-gated and approved by domestic regulators. Meanwhile, Western AAA games portraying graphic sexual violence, torture, or even child abuse continue to sell millions, with MasterCard and Visa supporting, so long as they're dressed up in cinematic presentation and come from a major publisher. It's not about what's allowed, it's about who's allowed to make it, and that's why these Japanese politicians are now sounding the alarm. This is a system where context doesn't matter. A game's fate isn't determined by courts, critics, or cultural norms. It's determined by risk officers in California, scared of bad press and activist noise, where an entire nation's creative industry can be throttled overnight by people who have never set foot there, let alone understood the media they're censoring. And the double standard is impossible to ignore. A Western studio can depict a sexual assault scene in cinematic slow motion, sell 10 million copies and collect awards, but a Japanese doujin circle publishes a fantasy comic with a suggestive elf girl and their account is frozen and their visibility erased. That's not regulation. It's digital colonialism. And if Japan, a global cultural powerhouse with its own laws and massive creative sector, can be quietly censored by a foreign payments cartel, then no one else stands a chance, because this kind of censorship is baked into the financial plumbing of the internet. It doesn't just stay local, it spreads invisibly, algorithmically, and indiscriminately until a single, sanitized, culturally loaded worldview becomes the only one permitted. If you've been gaming for a while, this whole fiasco might feel eerily familiar because we've lived through moral panics before. Back in the 1990s, it was Mortal Kombat, Night Trap and Doom setting off the alarms. Politicians lined up to denounce them, headlines screamed about corrupted youth, and a full-blown media circus erupted over pixelated blood and digitized women in leotards. It was absurd, but at least it was public. And that's a key difference here, because the 90s panic played out in the open. We got Senate hearings, expert panels, media debates, and front page arguments. Yes, it was often hysterical and misguided, but it was still democratic. And from that chaos came something tangible. The ESRB, a standardized age rating system that empowered consumers to make informed decisions instead of outsourcing morality to corporate boards. It wasn't perfect, but it was transparent, predictable, visible, and today's version of that, well, none of that. It's all about ESG scores and investor safety, and that makes the censorship quieter, harder to trace, and far more insidious. And that's exactly what made Collective Shout so effective. They didn't need a Senate hearing, they didn't need to win the public over. All they had to do was convince a handful of risk-averse middle managers that hosting certain games might hurt their ESG metrics or draw unwanted attention from activist investors. With one spreadsheet and a few headlines, they did what moral crusaders back in the 90s could never do. They got adult games erased from digital storefronts, creators demonetized, and financial access cut off, all without public debate, regulatory oversight, or any clear pathway to challenge the decision. So say what you will about ESRB, at least you knew what the rules were. Now, the rules change without notice. What we're left with is a ghost protocol. A blacklist is shaped by a quiet lobbying group, unseen metrics, and corporate aversion to risk, and all it took to have thousands of games delisted was a strongly worded email and a spreadsheet sent to the right people. As scary as all of this has been so far, and let's be honest, this is bloody scary, what's even more terrifying and dystopian is that this could just be the tip of the iceberg, because the real danger isn't just about the games that got removed, it's about the power shift they represent. Since corporations are allowed to decide what counts as acceptable, that definition doesn't stay fixed. It expands and shifts and will continue to get weaponized. If certain tags are now too risky for payment processors, how long until all sexualized content is swept up? Simply because it might ruffle a few feathers in a boardroom in Zurich or trigger a backlash in Middle America. Japanese visual novels are already being purged for complying with their own laws in Japan. So, what happens when the spotlight turns to Western games? Do optional romance routes in RPGs get flagged next? Do modding platforms like Nexus suddenly clean house? Are entire genres quietly blacklisted for being too bleak or too political, or just too much of a reputational risk? Because that's what happens when morality becomes a matter of brand management. History shows us that censorship rarely starts with bans, it actually begins with silence. In gaming, with developers quietly abandoning ideas they know won't make it past the algorithm. Stories that won't get told, not because they were rejected, but because they were never pitched in the first place. Teams that second guess themselves, and projects that get scaled back and sanitized and self-censored, not by the law, but by the looming threat of demonetization and delisting. And maybe you think that's just business, that if creators want to get paid, they should avoid controversy, but that's not really the question. The real question is, who decides what counts as too controversial? Because at this point, it's clearly not the developers or the players or the gaming media. It's a few financial gatekeepers and ideological lobbyists making decisions on your behalf across borders without your input and with no accountability. But there is some hope to take away from this disastrous situation. Sure, it's easy to feel powerless when billion-dollar institutions operate in back rooms, but that doesn't mean nothing works. And people are pushing back, and in some places it is working. When DL Site, one of Japan's largest storefronts for indie and adult games, came under pressure, they didn't cave. They cut ties with Visa and MasterCard and adopted crypto. They added support for prepaid store cards, and yes, it cost them, but it preserved their autonomy and protected their creators. It was a line in the sand, and it helped. In Japan's government, Diet member Yamada Taro, whom we mentioned earlier, went beyond social media and outrage. He launched formal hearings into how foreign financial institutions are rewriting Japan's domestic content policies. That's structural resistance, the kind that pushes for transparency and regulatory oversight. Even in the West, resistance is growing. Petitions demanding an end to financial censorship have racked up tens of thousands of signatures. I know that petitions obviously don't change policy overnight, but they do show politicians, platforms and press outlets that silence is no longer the default and that people are paying attention. So, what else can you do? Well, we can start by simply staying informed. Tools like SteamDB can help us track delistings, stealth edits, and suspicious removals. If a game vanishes without explanation, don't let it fade. Document it, share it, archive it. Censorship thrives in silence, but visibility disrupts that cycle. Support developers directly wherever possible through personal sites, DRM-free storefronts or alternative processors. Every time you cut out a middleman, it gets harder for banks to dictate the content pipeline and, above all, speak up. Because this isn't just about adult visual novels or 1 month's purge. It's about what kind of culture we're building and who gets to decide what survives in it. Collective Shout, for all their theocratic, regressive, anti-consumer views, still managed to pressure billion-dollar corporations into doing what they wanted with just targeted emails, press campaigns, and coordinated messaging. If they can do that to silence art, then we can do the same to protect it. Imagine that kind of collective pressure pointed the other way, not to delete games, but to defend them. Not to punish creators, but to empower them. Because this isn't just about visual novels, is it? It's not just about Steam, is it? And it's certainly not just about fucking sex in games. This is about power and about control and about who gets to decide what's allowed to exist and whether you're willing to hand that decision over to a faceless corporate algorithm. It's cheesy and cliche to say, but each of you has a voice, so please just use it, like I and so many others are doing right now to highlight this situation. And also, don't forget that right now you can lock in Expedition 33 for 43% off and Black Myth Wukong for 37% off, Stellarblade for 29% off, and the gorgeous Wu Chang Fallen Feathers for 32% off, all through my discount links. Thousands more retro and modern titles are discounted by up to 90%. So, whether you're building a forever library or just grabbing that wishlist title before it quietly disappears, there will certainly be something for you. And if you'd like to support my work more directly, including getting access to my full behind-the-scenes cosplay library, consider backing me over on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.